the few of you. It's good to see you this afternoon. We will start on our next book of the Bible that we will be surveying this afternoon in a few minutes. But first of all, prayer requests and announcements. I'll begin. Christy's homesick tonight. She thinks she just has the sniffles, or some kind of cold or something. But since we can't have confirmation because we couldn't find a COVID test, she closed Mother's Day down tomorrow just because she can't be sure what the situation is. But please don't pass around that Christy has COVID, because we don't know Christy has COVID. She's just sick. But anyway, any other announcements or prayer requests tonight? Yes, sir.
Checked up with the Osborne family back on Saturday. She had gotten a COVID test, but I talked to Larry. Donna is doing better.
Okay. Good. Good to see you back, David. You feeling better tonight?
Feeling a lot better.
Good.
I tested negative with a COVID test,
But you just had something nasty, huh?
oh yeah, I got something nasty. But
That's the thing. There's still a lot of nasty stuff out there besides COVID, isn't there?
there is. Just because you're sick doesn't mean you got COVID.
That's right.
But we do have a prayer request for a friend of ours, Misty,
Mhm.
and her son and Zach. There's a lot of problems going on right now, and Zach, they both got COVID. And
Misty is who?
our friend, and
Okay.
it's Zach's roommate's mom.
Okay.
And it's a mess. It really is such a mess over there. So much to get into, but God knows what's going on. But it's things got real messy.
It's
They're under control, but we just hope it stays that way.
okay. All right. So Zach's improving.
Well, he didn't really get that much in the way of symptoms.
Mhm.
He was vaccinated.
I meant he's still at Project Rescue, correct? And how's that working out for him so far?
That's kind of where
He's I probably had to miss some classes because of the COVID.
they put him in. They put both of them in a hotel room for their program because they're mentally unstable.
Mhm.
And
Tough stuff. I know that's hard for y'all to deal with. We'll definitely keep praying for him, and we're rooting for him. All right. Any other prayer requests or announcements this afternoon, evening? Pray for Amy. Amy is recovering from COVID. Okay. And Nathan said Cannon was kind of afraid of it. Afraid he was going to get it. Okay. Good. Imagine it is scary to the kids, especially. It's scary to us, so it's got to be scary for them. Any others? All right, Bill, do you mind leading prayer, or do I need to call on somebody else? I don't know. You lead prayers for us, don't you?
Oh, sure.
Okay. I don't like to put anybody on the spot that don't want to do it. Okay.
Let's pray. Father, we're thankful for this day. We're thankful for the blessings that you pour out on us each day. We're so thankful for our congregation, and those who lead it, for our brothers and sisters in Christ. Father, several have been mentioned. We'd ask you to please watch over them, watch over their family. We hope that the doctors will do the things to help them
Okay. All right, we are ready to start the book of Numbers. One more thing, I forgot to mention this prayer request, so we won't say another prayer now in class, but just remember with your prayers, please to include the Bible study I have ongoing. Sometimes it's on Tuesdays, sometimes it's on Wednesdays. It was today, but we finally made it to the Green Book, the one that we usually start on here, and we got halfway through that today, and it went really good. It's taken a long time to get here, but man, I see some good signs after all this. So please pray for this study. Okay, tonight we will be looking again at the book of Numbers. You see on the screen behind me the Barnes Bible charts that you can go on the internet and you can access these for free. And most of the things you see on the screen there, I will mention at least at some point in my introduction to this book. The Hebrew title for this book is taken from the first phrase, one of the first phrases in the book. Somebody read for me Numbers chapter 1, verse 1, please. Okay, so the Hebrews named this, their title for this book was the word translated in the wilderness. And so this book was in the wilderness for them. Actually a pretty good title, when you think about it, but they used the Hebrew word for translated in the wilderness for their title for the book. The English title, Numbers, comes from, it's kind of brought through several languages. When the Hebrews translated the Hebrew scriptures to the Greek Septuagint around 247 BC, it was commissioned by one of the Ptolemies, and it wasn't finished till 132 BC. But they gave the Greek title arithmoi, which the Latin, when the Catholics translated it to Latin a few centuries later, in the Latin Vulgate, that translated to numeri, which in English, the word for that is numbers. Well, the name Numbers, that's a pretty good title for the book also, because there are two censuses taken within the book. One at the very beginning of the book, the children of Israel are still at the foot of Mount Sinai. When we got to the end of the book of Exodus, that's where they were camped, at the base of Mount Sinai. Throughout the entire book of Leviticus, it was a book largely about law, and there wasn't hardly any narrative in that book. And so they're still at the base of the Mount Sinai throughout the entirety of that book. And now when we pick this book up, that's where they're still located at. They actually spent a year at the base of Mount Sinai. And so the book commences, they're still there. They were commanded to take a census of the people. And so there's one recorded right there in the first few chapters of the book. And then when we get to chapter 26, an entire generation has died in the wilderness. And now we have a second generation of Israelites. And so they take a census again. There's just a few thousand differences. But there's also description in there of who's to be counted and who's not to be counted. And I won't get into all those details because we have so much to cover. Numbers is a sequel then to the book of Exodus. Numbers being almost void of any narrative. So it really seems like if you were teaching somebody Hebrew history, you could just entirely skip the book of Leviticus if all you were looking at was a historical standpoint of what happened and what happened next. You would go from Exodus straight to the book of Numbers. The only incident you might want to include from the book of Leviticus is probably that instance with Nadab and Abihu. There's very little other narrative within that book. This book it's the continuing journey of the Israelites in their leaving Exodus and going into the Promised Land. It covers about 39 years in this book, at least the narrative, all the things that take place. It covers about a 39-year period of time. The dates given from Numbers chapter 1, verse 1, from when they left Sinai to at least the 5th month of the 40th year, which is the date given in chapter 33, verse 38 of Aaron's death. Aaron died in the 5th month of the 40th year. And so that's included within the narrative. So we're at least somewhere around within around the 40th year, the 40th year after they left Egypt. So somewhere around 39 years. It was about 39 years. It was about, I believe it said, what's Numbers 1:1 say? If somebody's got your Bible open to that location, Numbers 1:1. What's the date given in that verse? First day of the 2nd month of the 2nd year. Okay, so they've already been out of Egypt for 2 years, and that goes on to the 40th year. So 38, 39 years, somewhere roughly. That's the time frame covered in this book. Again, this book claims a Mosaic authorship. We're not going to get into all the evidence of a Mosaic authorship because most of it we've already covered in the other books that were written by him. But more than at least 80 times or more, we read the phrase, the Lord spoke to Moses in this book. Almost all of the chapters begin with that statement that the Lord said to Moses. And not only that, within the chapters there's even more. The purpose of the book is to continue, first and foremost, is to continue the historical narrative of the nation of Israel's release from Egyptian bondage and their arrival into the Promised Land. So, first and foremost, to continue the narrative. Second, I think a person reading Book of Numbers I think most people would come away with the idea that obedience, the necessity of obedience and the results of disobedience is something that's very strongly taught within this book. What could have been a journey of, some suggest, I think it's even on the screen here, what could have been as short as an 11-day journey ended up taking them 40 years. Why? Because of disobedience. And so obedience, the necessity of obedience, is a strong theme within the book, and the results of disobedience is strongly seen within this book. Words that describe the story of Numbers, I think wandering, work, and war are some words that really describe this book. Wandering, they spend 40 years wandering. War is, I'll mention this again in a moment, but war is mentioned, I think, 31 times within the book, more than any other book of the Bible. The Israelites are constantly either being numbered for war, preparing for war, or in the middle of a war. Through the whole book, that war is on the horizon. And then, of course, work. Lots of things in this book about God, about service to God and how God expected them to be working. And then 3 other words we could associate with the book are discontent, disaster, and discipline. The people were discontent. They murmured and complained all the time, which led to one disaster after another, and God disciplining them. So there's 6 words that all are alliterated for you already. Wandering, work, and war. Discontent, disaster, and discipline. Those words describe this book very well. Summary of the book, its main divisions, chapters 1 through 4. The consensus is taken, the first one. Chapters 5 through 10, the older generation, there's 2 generations seen within this book. The older generation prepares to inherit the Promised Land, chapters 5 through 10. But then, second half of chapter 10 through chapter 21, the older generation failed to inherit the Promised Land. Who remembers why they failed to inherit the Promised Land? Remember, they sent spies into the land, sent 12 of them in. 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, came back saying, the Lord is with us. We're able to overcome. But the other 10 came back talking about how big the giants were in the lands, and they had what we sometimes call grasshopper complex. They said, we were but as grasshoppers in their sight, or in our own sight in comparison to them. And so they had an inferiority complex or a grasshopper complex. They didn't let their faith in God and the fact that God was with them lead them into making the decisions they made. Instead, they were driven by fear. And so, because of that, they were made to wander in the wilderness, and God said, you will not enter into the promised land. Your carcasses are going to fall in the wilderness. And that's the words he used, or the words as they're translated in the English translation. And so, next in chapters 22 through 25, we read about their war with the Moabites and about that character by the name of Balaam. And then there's a second consensus taken in chapter 26 of the new generation. And then chapters 27 through 36, the new generation prepares to inherit the promised land. And so that's, you might say, the main divisions within the book, a bird's eye view of what happens within it. Some other key events, and some of those I just mentioned might also be included. Again, key events within the book of Numbers. This is not not a comprehensive list. These are just some of them that I thought about, or as I looked through an outline, I was reminded of. The service of the Levites. That's recorded in chapter 3 and 4. Why would the service of the Levites be important? We just saw that Sunday morning. Remember how we saw the service of how the Kohathites and the children of Merari and Gershom, I think was the other one, how they were given different assignments, and we saw how that came into play in something a person might never even have thought of. What does that have to do with Uzzah's error? But as we put it all together, we saw it had a lot to do with why Uzzah was struck down for steady in that ark. In chapter 5, we read about restitution of sin. That's something a lot of people have forgotten today, that restitution is a principle that is taught within the Bible. When you do something, when you trespass against someone and you cost someone money, or you damage some of their property, or something along those lines, restitution is something taught within the Bible. You pay it back to them. And in fact, the laws under the Old Testament were, not only do you pay them back what you damaged, but you give them a fifth of interest on top of it. That's God's law. So you do something, you cost your brother, you accidentally do something that ends up with your brother's cattle die because of something you did. Not only do you pay the cattle back, but you put a fifth of that cost on top of it. And so that'd be a good deterrent that'd be a good thing to motivation to mind your own business and stay out of your brother's field, wouldn't it? Not do anything. The Spies Report is in chapters 13 and 14. Korah led a rebellion of 250 princes against Moses in chapter 16. Chapter 17, after that was all done, there was the event where Aaron's rod budded. Each of the tribes had a rod or staff there that had the name of the tribe engraved on it, and they were all put up overnight. I can't remember all the details, but I remember the next morning Aaron's rod budded. Not only did it have blooms coming out of it, but it also had, I believe it said that it had almonds coming from it as well. And so that was a sign that Aaron and the tribe of Levi was ordained by God to be the leaders. And so so the people who had a problem with the leadership, God said, this is my choice, not yours. In chapter 20, there was an opposition of Edom. That's somewhat of an important biblical event, especially if you're thinking about the relationship. It goes all the way back to Jacob and Esau. The Edomites were descendants of Esau, and they caused problems for the Jews. This is one of the major confrontations they had with the Jews. They could have just let the Israelites pass through their land. Wouldn't have been any trouble, but no, because of the opposition between them, even though they were kinfolk, they said, no, you're not traveling through our land. So the Israelites had to go way out of the way, and then there was a lot of murmuring and complaining as a result of that. Fiery serpents, the sin of Moses at Meribah, chapter 20. Then there's the fiery serpents and the serpent of brass in chapter 21. The defeat of Sihon, the king of the Amorites, and the defeat of Og of Bashan in chapter 21. The account of Balak and Balaam in chapters 22 through 25. Idolatry at Peor, chapter 25. Joshua was chosen as a successor to Moses in chapter 27. Then there was the war with Midian, recorded in chapter 31. Then chapter 32, that we are introduced to the Transjordan tribes, and that is before they crossed over the Jordan River. The tribes of Reuben and Gad, and I think in the half tribe of Manasseh, they had a lot of cattle, and they determined that this land, that land right there that they had already conquered by the kings, by Sihon and Og, by conquering those people, they had already conquered that land, and so a couple of the tribes decided they wanted that land. And that was okay. They were granted that land. But they were told they promised that they would go up, continue to fight with the rest of the Israelites until the land on the west side of the Jordan was conquered. And then finally, chapter 35, we read about the cities of refuge. And it wasn't too long, we were talking about that too. I think it was on one of our Sunday afternoon lessons about 7 things God hates. We talked about hands that shed innocent blood. And within that, we talked a little bit about the cities of refuge and how things were done back then. So there's an overview of the book of Numbers and some of the key things that happened within it. Now, let's look at the map and let's look at some of the key places within this book. We're going to start right here. Again, they are at the Mount Sinai. They're still at the base of Mount Sinai when this book begins. And they were given the 10 Commandments there. They were given the pattern for the tabernacle and its furnishings. They were given many other commands, statutes, and judgments that make up the book of Leviticus. And finally, after a full year at Mount Sinai, the Israelites broke camp and they began their march to the Promised Land, and they started by crossing this wilderness of Paran here. Across the wilderness of Sinai. Of course, they already been through the wilderness of Sinai to arrive at Mount Sinai. Leaving there, then they come into the wilderness of Paran, or Paran, however you pronounce that. It was from this location that the spies were sent into the land of Canaan to determine the strength of the enemy's fortifications. Then they come to Kadesh. Kadesh. This was an oasis area where Israel spent most of the time of their wilderness years. They spent more time in this location through those 40 years than any other place. It was here that Miriam died, Moses' sister, and also here where Moses struck the rock and sinned in doing so. Arid is the next location. Arid is the name of a Canaanite king and the territory over which he ruled. When this king learned that Israel had sent spies into the land, he attacked them. It's recorded in Numbers 21, and he was soundly defeated. Then the next place you will see is Edom. Now Edom, the Edomite king, of course these are cousins to the Israelites. These are the descendants of Esau, while the Israelites are the descendants of Jacob. And so they're brethren, they're cousins. They should have been friendly, but instead they would not let them travel through their land. So instead they had to go north and around, and they had to go right through Ammon and Moab and Bashan, which means they had to face off against them. They probably would have done so anyway, but it's recorded there for all ages, I guess, so that we could continue to know about the feud going on between Edom and the Israelites. Ammon is the next location. The king of this region, Sihon, also refused to let the Israelites pass through his land. And so he attacked, and his army was defeated and conquered, and the Israelites conquered that entire territory, chapter 21. Bashan is the next the territory that they entered. Moses sent spies into Bashan, and King Og attacked, and he was defeated. Chapter 21, 33, and 35. And you remember later on when they cross over in the Jordan and they come to that city of Jericho where they meet that woman named Rahab who was a harlot, and she told them, "Our hearts did melt within us when we heard about all the things that happened in Egypt and how you defeated the kings Og and Sihon." And so word of these battles is getting out. And people are wondering, how is this ragtag band of misfits that were slaves in Egypt, how are they conquering all this land? God must be with these people. Then they come to the plains of Moab. The plains of Moab, right here. The people camped on the plains of Moab, east of the Jordan River, across from Jericho. Here they were on the verge of crossing over into the Promised Land. It's recorded in chapter 22. King Balak of Moab was terrified of the Israelites. And so, remember what he did? He hired this famous sorcerer by the name of Balaam, and he hired him to go to the mountains overlooking where their army was camped out and pronounce curses upon them. But the Lord wouldn't allow him to pronounce curses. The Lord caused him to bless them instead. Chapter 22 through 24. And then finally, the last location, Gilead. Gilead, the tribes of Reuben and Gad, and also the half-tribe of Manasseh, decided to settle this fertile area east of the Jordan River because it was a good land for their sheep. They promised, first of all, though, to help the rest of the tribes conquer the land west of the Jordan. So that summarizes the book and the locations within the book pretty well. Now, the best part. What lessons can we learn from this? I've got quite a few. Maybe you've got more. The one I want to start with is God's people must be prepared for war. Let's go back to this word, war. It appears 31 times, which is by far more than in any other book. The children of God were always in this book either being counted for war, being prepared for war, or fighting war. And that's also true even today. God's people must be prepared for war, but of course the war we're fighting isn't a physical one like the one were fighting was. Ours is spiritual. To use the words of Paul, 2 Corinthians 10, 3 and 4, for though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds. Or as he said to the Ephesians 6:12, for we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, against rulers of darkness in this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. And so there's there's a spiritual application to this, the fact that they were always being prepared for war. I think you'll see how that applies even more with this. It kind of walks hand in hand with this next point. Another lesson we can learn is a lesson from the wilderness. The wilderness in this book could be seen as symbolic of the world. No, they had to travel through this wilderness to get to the Promised Land. We have to travel through the world to get through the Promised Land. There's a whole lot of parallelism between the entire journey from Egypt all the way to the Promised Land. There is so much typology within that section of the Bible, it's hard to keep up with it all, to be honest. For example, just to scrape the surface a little bit, bondage to Egypt was a type of bondage to sin. Moses, the deliverer, was a type of Christ, who is our deliverer. The crossing of the Red Sea was a type of baptism. The congregation of Israel in the wilderness is a type of the church in the world. And the Promised Land is a type of heaven. Now I've got verses for all those if you want the verses for all those as well. Tell you what, it's a great lesson. I'm just going to go ahead and say it again. I'll give you the verses. I'm going to give you the verse in Numbers, and then I'll give you the correlating verse in the New Testament which shows it's a type. Okay? Here you go. Bondage to Egypt was a type of bondage to sin. John 8:34. John 8:34 shows that's a type. Moses was the deliverer. He was a type of Christ. John 1:17, Ephesians 1:7, Galatians 5:1. If you can't keep up with me, remember we're recording these. You can go back and watch it again. The crossing of the Red Sea was a type of baptism. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 and 2. The congregation of Israel in the wilderness is a type of the church in the world. Acts 7:38, 1 Corinthians 5, 9 through 11. And then the Promised Land is a type of heaven. Hebrews 11, 9 through 10, and 13 through 16. In the same way, the wilderness is something that God's people have to endure in this life. We have to endure hardships like they did. We have to fight battles. And we're told to be good soldiers of Christ while we do in doing it. We have to be in the world, but not of the world. We have to do all this without faith, without fear, and without murmuring and complaining. As God's people, we don't necessarily have to die in the wilderness like some of them did, but we definitely have to travel through it. So I think that's a great lesson within the book of Numbers. A third one, we'd see something about the relationship between faith and fear here. Faithlessness in this book, faithlessness brought about fearfulness, and then that fearfulness brought about more unfaithfulness. This lesson comes from Numbers 13 and 14, where the spies were sent into the land, and they came back. The weak faith of 10 of those spies promoted fear in the entire congregation, which in turn resulted in the unfaithfulness of the entire congregation. They got grasshopper complex. Indeed, there were giants in the land. But the problem wasn't the giants in the land. God was well able to overcome them. The problem was the complex they had when they said, Numbers 13:33, we were but in our own sight as grasshoppers. That's what the problem was. It was fear and faithlessness. The opposite is seen in Joshua and Caleb, the other two spies that were sent in the land. And the opposite lesson is this, that faithfulness brings about fearlessness. These men were absolutely fearless. It didn't matter what they saw. They saw giants, they didn't care. Why? Because they had faith. They had faith, and so faith, instead of bringing fear, brought fearlessness. Because of their faith in God, they weren't afraid of the strength of the enemy or the odds. And so it's clear from this book that God desires of His people to have faith and be fearless. I'm reminded of New Testament verse, 2 Timothy 1:7, for God hath not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. There's another lesson for us, one about murmuring and complaining. In the book of Numbers, there are 7 different times that the people, at least 7, I think it's 7, it may be even more. Now that I say 7, for some reason I'm thinking of a lecture that B.J. Clark taught one time on the book of Exodus. I want to say he may have said there was 10. But I know there's at least 7. In chapter 11, 1 through 3, there was one. Don't quote me on that. I don't want B.J. calling me up. Bruce, were you saying I'm saying? No, that's just what I seem to recall. The first time they complained is chapter 11 concerning the way God led them. They didn't like the way God was leading. They didn't like the way they were being led. And then a few verses later, number 2, chapter 11, 4 and 6, they complained about the manna that they were being fed. And then in chapter 13, 33 through 14:2, they complained concerning the land and the giants that were in it. And then in chapter 16 and 17, they complained that about the leaders that God had appointed over them. And then in chapter 14, 39 through 45, and also chapter 16, 41, they complained concerning God's judgments. And then in chapter 22 through 5, they complained because they were thirsty and they didn't have enough to drink in the desert. And then in chapter 21, 4 through 9, they complained again about the provision of manna and they wanted something else to eat. These murmurings and complaints were against God, and God was not too awfully happy about the way they were complaining. And so they are given throughout the Bible as examples of unbelief and ingratitude. And they caused a lot of grief for Moses, and they caused a lot of grief for God. God didn't tolerate it one bit, but He punished it very severely. In fact, we can just read a short reading. Let's look at Numbers chapter 14 together, and let's just know how God feels about such complaining, murmuring and complaining. Numbers 14, 27 through 35. We'll start at verse 26. And the Lord spake unto Moses and unto Aaron, saying, How long shall I bear with this evil congregation, which murmur against me? I have heard the murmurings of the children of Israel, which they murmur against me. Say unto them, As truly as I live, saith the Lord, as you have spoken in my ears, so will I do to you. Your carcasses shall fall in this wilderness. You know, they had said, They had said, this is a little ironic, they had said, we'd be better off to die in this wilderness than to suffer like we are. And so God said, as you said, it's going to be done. He said, your carcasses will fall in the wilderness, and all that were numbered of you, according to your whole number, from 20 years old and upward, which have murmured against me. Doubtless you shall not come into the land, concerning which I swear to make you dwell therein, save Caleb and the son of Jephunneh and Joshua the son of Nun. But your little ones, which you said would be a prey, them will I bring, and they shall know the land which you have despised. But as for you, your carcasses, they shall fall in the wilderness, and your children shall wander in the wilderness 40 years, and bear your whoredoms until your carcasses be wasted in the wilderness. That's pretty strict, ain't it, folks?
Bruce, if you look at chapter 14, verse 20,
Mm-hmm.
it does say that God said, you have put me to test now 10 times.
10 times. Okay. Then I need to go back and find those other 3 and put them in my notes as well. I'm glad you... What verse is that again?
14:20.
14:20. 22. Because all those men which have seen...
22.
You have tempted me now these 10 times. That's right. You know, I was looking in one of my books, and they had it already summarized there for me, the 7 murmurings. So I put that down, but then as I was teaching it, I thought, that don't sound right. I thought I remembered 10, and thank you for pointing that out to me. So God doesn't like murmuring and complaining. I have a good idea He doesn't feel any different about it today than He did then. Here's another lesson, lesson number 5. Sometimes a faithless generation must pass before change can occur. Woo, some people may not like this lesson. Some people might like this one. There are times when people, you know, there's a saying, what is that saying about, some people are too old to change, you know. What's that saying about?
Can't teach an old dog new tricks.
That's one of them. That's one of them. You know, sometimes people don't want to change. And there's an older generation sometimes in the church. From one congregation to another, it might differ a little bit, but there's some people that they don't change. They don't plan on changing, and they act like no one should expect them to change. They've been like this way all their life, and they're not going to change. They may not change in ways that the church really needs them to change to be able to go forward. They may not change their apathy towards the service of the Lord. They may not change in their lack of evangelistic effort. They may not change in their hard-nosed criticism of others and their binding of scruples. And they may give little effort to changing their own sinful flaws of character. New converts, though, I have noticed that when you convert people to the Lord, generally, new converts are pretty excited about these things. Generally, new converts are ready to go teach somebody the gospel. They're excited about it. Generally, they are pretty zealous and not apathetic. Generally, they're pretty humble and not very critical. That being the case, I have often pointed out to some of these young people that I have converted, don't go set with the people. Don't get too close to the members of the church that aren't doing anything. And that might offend some of you. I don't care. You know, in the Bible, in this account, in this book, a generation had to die so that the next generation could do what God wanted them to do. And I have told young people in the church sometimes, you just keep doing what's right. Don't do what you see. Don't be just a pew setter like you see some of the older folks doing. Do what the Bible tells you to do, and one day the old generation's going to die, and then maybe we can move forward. Now, that might be offensive to some people, but it's true. I'm sorry, it's just true. And so I think that's a great lesson from this book. And the principles set forth in this book, either get busy serving God faithfully or watch the next generation suffer through your mistakes until you're gone. Isn't that what God pretty much told them? There's another lesson about the consequences of rebellion. This lesson comes from Korah's rebellion, Numbers chapter 16 and 17. Just to sum it up real quickly, rebellion will not be tolerated and rebels will be punished. There are quite a few types in the book of Numbers. For example, the smitten rock. 1 Corinthians 10:4 tells us that was a type of Christ. The brazen serpent, John 3:14 tells us that was a type of Christ. The cities of refuge, Hebrews 6:18 tells us that was a type of Christ. animal sacrifices being made outside the camp. Hebrews 13:12 tells us that was a type of Christ. And so that's quite a few lessons. I want to leave you just a few minutes to... I've got one more. I'm going to save it for the invitation here in just a few minutes. But if you've got some others that you would like to bring up or go back to one of these others and talk about it, now's your time. Yes, sir.
That was a really good point about how, I think their original journey to Canaan was, what, about 2 weeks?
It said on that screen that it could have taken them as short as 11 years or 11 days. I didn't do that math myself. So.
But I mean, it's around that time.
Mm-hmm.
Anywhere from 2 weeks to a month, and it just goes to show you they could have done, they had to make the journey.
Mm-hmm.
It was already a command. And had they done it faithfully, they wouldn't have turned it into a 40-year punishment.
Mm-hmm.
If you had just done what you were supposed to do, I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've looked at my own life like that. Like if I would have just done it right the first time, I wouldn't be playing with it for about 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
And that was what I got out of it.
Israel kind of walked in circles again when they got to the book of Judges. When we get to the book of Judges, it's as if the wilderness wanderings wasn't enough for them already. But God told them, if you don't drive all, in fact, His command is actually in the book of Numbers. Near the end, He tells them, I want you to go in and drive all the inhabitants out of the land. And He warns them, if you allow them to stay in the land, they will be something like pricks in your eyes and pricks to your side, and your thorns in your sides and all that. And that's exactly what they did. They decided to make some of them slaves, tried to make some of them tributary, they decided to live in peace and harmony with some of them. And what happened? The book of Judges tells you what happened. They ended up becoming enslaved to them. And then they walked in. You see through that whole book of Numbers a big circle, a cycle of apostasy over and over again. It's like they're walking in circles again. Good point. Who's next? Patrick.
A complaining, negative group or congregation in this case can even bring good leaders down. You can look at chapter 20 when the people complained about water, and even Moses, he knew what he had to do,
Mm-hmm.
but in his frustration did the wrong thing, and the penalty was he and Aaron could go into the land.
That's right. That's right. That's a good point. And I believe the New Testament talks about the elders being our leaders, that we should be obedient to them and work under them in such a way as to make their leadership a joy for them rather than a burden. And Moses is a great example of one who was a great leader of God, but boy, he had it tough because of the murmuring and complaining going on. Good lessons. Paulette?
I've always thought the significance of the fact that the Lord told Moses to speak to the rock,
Mm-hmm.
but then he struck the rock and remembered the Lord. And I've always, in talking with someone, to say, we don't know whether Moses did speak to the rock,
Mm-hmm.
but then he went on to strike the rock. So this is a lesson about us needing to do what God tells us to do, not to go beyond what God tells us to do. Or even say, well, God didn't say to do this. To me, this is such a strong lesson because he had chosen Moses to lead his people into the promised land, and Moses, his punishment, or he was disciplined and not allowed to go into it.
That's another lesson right there, that God God expects obedience out of His leaders just as much as He does everyone else. And leaders are not exempt from the law. And Moses sinned. Moses suffered for that sin too. And what a tough thing after leading that murmuring, complaining people for 40 years through that wilderness. Then he got to look over at it but not go in it. You know, it's a tough lesson. Did I see another hand over here? Okay, I'm sorry I forgot to, when you guys ask questions, I need to repeat those because the recording is not getting those questions that you're asking. So we can either do that or maybe pass a mic around or something if I keep forgetting. So. All right, I guess we'll stop there. I have one more lesson. I'll tell you that one as means of our invitation here in just a few minutes.